start spreading the news. I'm leaving today.
Well, I'm really excited to bring you the quilters from Semper Tedium. I don't know them, but I know the program that we're going to show you. And this program really speaks to our mission, and it's what attracted me to become a board member when Meg asked me to be on the board of the Alliance. Because what the Alliance is all about, as I think most of you here know, is about saving our stories. And quilters have the most amazing stories. I've been a quilter for several decades, Mark would say centuries, but anyway. And I never get tired of hearing the stories. You would think I would after all these years. So many people have stories about quilts as quilt makers. But what's so amazing is, say I'm sitting on a plane and somebody asks me, what do you do? Well, I'm a quilter and I write quilting books and I do quilting shows. And you'd think that this high-power executive next to me would say, yeah, but everybody has a story. And so we were doing our Quilters Save Our Stories, which is really an oral history for quilters. And that is, a quilter sits down with you and you interview them, and then it's transcribed, and it's usually about 45 minutes, and they're giving their story as a quilter. And so it's involved, it's kind of for posterity. But then the idea came about that, like the person in the airplane seat next to me, everybody has a story, but it may not be their quilt, they may not be the quilt maker. So the idea came about, and I think this was Miss Amy's idea, that we should do something that's a little shorter and sweeter, so that whether you made the quilt or not, if you had a quilt story, it could be recorded and kept for posterity and also shared. So that's where Go Tell It at the Quilt Show came from, and that's what we're going to do with Semper Tedium. And what the idea is, it's 3 minutes, one story, one person, 3 minutes, one story saved. Is that right? And so essentially what you do, like Emma is set up with the camera, and she's going to shoot this person, and in this case it'll be the Semper Tedium ladies, talking about their quilts. And I've done this, it started at, the idea was quilt shows, but I've done it at libraries and in all different places, museums. And it's really neat because that one person gets up and they do their 3 minutes and they tell their story, and it's always so touching because people care so much about their quilts. So that's what you're going to see today. And then these, after they are recorded, they go out on YouTube. And eventually we're going to do something with our website. But right now we're just kind of feeling our way. So that's what Go Tell It's are, and that's what you're going to see. And so I want to introduce the ladies from Semper Tedium. So live from New York, it's Saturday morning with Paula Nanster. She's one of the
Alright. This is the story of 4 friends who are art quilters, or maybe we're 4 art quilters who are friends. And the 4 of us realized that although each of our unique signature styles is dramatically different from the others, we all have something in common. When it comes to quilt making, given an opportunity to keep it simple, each one of us has the proclivity to make something very complex. We are quilters who make quilts that take a very long time to make. And I have to find... This is a group, first of all, here we are. And this is a group with a motto to quilt by, Semper Tedium, which is our invented pseudo-Latin phrase meaning long live the labor-intensive artistic process, or always the hardest. There's more. We don't only have our own motto, we even have a manifesto, which I will read to you. Semper Tedium revels in process, rejoices in community, and celebrates artwork created in as much time as it takes. Working separately in urban spaces throughout the year, the 4 quilt artists in this exhibit have met twice a year for the past decade. These cherished artist retreats reinforce shared dedication to integrity of construction and pursuit of unique personal visions, in spite of societal pressure to work faster and produce more. The tongue-in-cheek phrase Semper Tedium celebrates the ritualistic act of creation for its own sake, a laborious and satisfying process. Often heard comments such as, how long did it take, or my, you must be so patient. You screwed that one, right? Anyone with time on their hands can make similarly accomplished works of art, if so inclined. This point of view overlooks the skill, artistry, and dedication necessary to realize any maker's unique vision, and subtly diminishes the status of art quilting, of quilt making. So not only do we have a motto and a manifesto, we even have a wee book written by Sam Decider that is for sale today. We'll be happy to sign it. I've been teaching for quilt guilds and events for over 20 years, and whenever I taught at a quilt retreat, I felt a little jealous. I wanted to share that indescribable gift of time and space to quilt with my friends. 3 of us live in cramped New York City apartments, lucky to have carved out a designated studio space big enough for one lone quilter. In July 2001, I invited Robin Schwab and Catherine Now to visit me at my mother's house on the end of the North Fork of Long Island, and turned the entire house into an artist studio. My mother didn't even notice the mess. I was delighted because she ate a lot better when the quilters were there. An added perk was that my cousin from Philadelphia, Amy Orr, who was a talented fiber artist, spent much of her summer at her family's cottage on the other side of the little town of Southold, and quickly became one of us. Since then, for over 10 years, we retreat to Southold twice a year. Don't tell our spouses that that's our favorite time of the year. Amy and I have inherited the family homes. We go once in the summer for the event we call Quilting by the Day, and once around the New Year for Lottie Fest, named after matriarchal Anne, to introduce me and Amy to fabulous textiles, but only if she found them at thrift shops and yard sales. Each one of us works on our own piece, but we can each point to how we've been influenced by the camaraderie. I want to make it very clear, our goal today is not to praise slowness for its own sake. We've each developed crucial techniques that we find satisfying and help us reach a vision and a personal aesthetic. I stuck that in for you, Project Runway fans, that personal aesthetic. These skills were earned by stubbornly persisting through many long hours. Although we do not begrudge a minute of all those hours, they are often peppered with setbacks and mishaps, which often turn out to be the takeaways, the lessons that tweak our skills and make our processes even richer, simultaneously more refined and adaptable. Keeping track of the number of hours is of no interest. We delight in artistry that is steeped in process and consider the time to create among friends a rare and much appreciated gift. We can think of no better way to express praise or approval than to say to one another, that is so Semper Tedium. So I'm going to show you a little bit about us. This is Southold, Long Island, the tip of Long Island, and I'm coming from the Bronx here, and Catherine comes from Manhattan, Robin's Brooklyn, and Amy's from Philadelphia. And so I have now inherited this house. I have lived in an apartment my entire life. In fact, I lived on the same block in the Bronx where I was born, and I don't even know how, my husband doesn't even know where the oil goes in this house, but we are now homeowners. It's kind of interesting. This is the view from the house. And we spend a lot of time staring, talking about the osprey nest and whether it's going to, if the ospreys are in there, or is the babies crying. So we can hear that as we see the osprey nest. And this is from the water, looking at the house. And this is the beach right down the block that we absolutely never go to. We choose to take a room this beautiful and turn it into this. Again, we food shop, we never leave. And so here you can see each one of us in our little spaces. And here looking towards the kitchen. Sometimes we go out on the Sweden porch, sometimes to quilt. I'm a hand quilter, mostly to eat. And we make these beautiful meals, including little kaleidoscopic meals. Okay, so now I'm going to just talk about myself, and then each one of us will talk a little bit, just showing you a little bit about our process. Here I am in my apartment hand quilting, and I am known for making pieces that are kaleidoscopic. My idea is to take to create on the flat surface of the quilt, a piece that looks like it's very, very spontaneous. It's going to move in the next second, not contrived. Something that really has a sense of light and gives you that sense of what a true kaleidoscope is. Here you see my first quilt made in 1969 in my college dorm with my $25 featherweight. When I cut up all my old clothes, cut them into 10-inch squares, sewed them back together, called their quilt, stuffed another quilt inside it. Never thought anyone really did that little quilty stitchy thing. And then a fairly recent quilt, which I actually have here. And you can kind of see the similarities. I always like to use a tremendous amount of color and complex fabrics. I'm really honored when somebody asks for permission to use my work for their own inspiration. This is somebody got in touch with me who was a mosaic artist and so created something similar to my quilt called Shards. I had an exhibit at the American Folk Art Museum that traveled around the country, and when it was in the Akron Art Museum, the Horticulture Society used it for a jumping off point for their annual conference. They picked certain quilts and then asked the members to make these incredible sculptures, floral sculptures based on the quilts. And then there was a story where I inspired a very large carpet in Houston, Texas, in the Hilton, 40,000 square feet, much more when they forgot to ask. But once I mentioned it to them, it was not a problem at all. They just gave me credit and I just went right up. I work in a really simple way on 18-inch graph paper. This becomes my ruler. And for those of you who purchased some fabric for me just now, you know I'm not really good at math. I have no idea where this idea came up. I think it's an urban myth that I am a mathematician. My quilts look like math. I know nothing about math, except I know that I'm going to take 360 degrees and divide it by the number of pieces of pi, meaning not the math pi, but just like apple pie, a piece of pie. I'm going to take 360 and divide it by 8 or 6 or 10, a number like that. And so if I'm going to divide it by 8, I get the number 45. Oops, sorry, and I will make 8 45-degree triangles, or six like a snowflake is going to be a shape like this, and 36, I will have 10 shapes. Whatever lands down the center is going to bring the eye around and around and around and around. Whatever lands along the side seam is going to mirror image and meet what happens on the other side. So I'm going to create effects that, greater, the whole is always greater than the sum of its parts. I don't sew, I actually don't sew very well. I go forward and back, and that's about it. And no matter how big my triangle is, no matter how many everything will eventually get sewn together in straight lines. This can be one fabric or 50, this can be one fabric or 50, but eventually there will be straight lines that allow me to sew it together. I think what's really different about the way that I use fabric in a traditional quilter is that in a traditional quilt, the artist, the quilter, has harsh contrast at the seams so that the audience can actually see the shape of the squares or whatever shape they want it to be made up of. Well, I have a tendency, because I want it to feel kaleidoscopic, as if many beautiful pieces of glass are floating together against one common background, I camouflage my seams. So using the first formula, if I have fabric 1 and 2, I make a template off of my diagram, including seam allowance, and then in this case, you see a lot of contrast between the two fabrics. You see a straight line. While my MO is really to camouflage that. So here's fabric 1 and 2. I draw hints from the fabric onto the template with a permanent marker, including the seam allowance, and then when patch A sews to patch 2, your eye no longer sees the seam. So here you see one whole wedge made up of many, many different fabrics when, little elements that snake down will snake up again. You barely see certain elements. But again, the whole is always greater than the sum of its parts. And so we end up with something that feels very kaleidoscopic. This is what all my fabric looks like. I live in a really urban neighborhood. Sometimes there are detectives right outside having coffee with each other. And of course, they're all talking about the dead body. That's where I live. But here I am in my apartment. And I have a great kaleidoscope collection and a way to hang wonderful quilts. And this is the quilt that I made in 2001 when we first started working together at our retreat. It was called It's About Time, because it was about time I did something different. It is a true kaleidoscopic mirror system, a 4-mirror system, but something a little bit different. And I can change this wonderful system that I have here very easily in my small space. And it's very amazing that that the room, which isn't very large, the living room, looks so big and wonderful when there are 4 or 5 quilts hanging on it. And when right now I ran around this morning and ripped them off, pulled them down to bring here, and now the room looks very small and empty. It's very interesting. You'd think that all these different textiles on the wall would make it, would really close it in, and it's exactly the opposite. Here's some more kaleidoscopes. And I have a set of dishes from Gerudo, Italy that I'm very proud of. Actually, I'm going to be talking about that in my 3-minute talk, so I will mention that later. But these are the inspiration for this quilt. You see, this is the only place in my apartment that is big enough for me to have laid it out. And it's called Service for 8, and I'll be speaking later about how I have no place in my apartment to actually serve 8. It is my homage. And I don't come out of an art background. I'm an occupational therapist with a master's in psych, and I've learned the hard way almost, maybe a lesson that you might learn in art school, to work in a series. I think it was the greatest gift I gave myself, and at first I actually thought it was probably the wrong path to take. But by working in a series, the questions I ask myself get more and more complex while the answers get simpler. And things I cannot do, I could not do a few years ago, I'm now able to do. When someone asks me how long does it take to make a quilt, I always say my whole life, because I have all the experience of the previous quilts, and where I used to be almost nervous about what will I do next or what will I do next. Now I'm like really fascinated to see what will the next idea be. It's like that wonderful moment where you don't know something and the next second it's like, oh, I could do it this way. And from that moment on, that's part of my baggage that I bring to the table. And I've always wanted to make very narrow wedges and didn't know how to put all those seam allowances together unless, up until 10. I could do 10 wedges. And then I realized that what I could do, this is actually what it would look like if I had 16 wedges in the center. But here, what I could do is do 22 and a half, which is half of a 45. So 2 together, that's what it would look like, too much seam allowance in the middle. I whack off the top, I give it a common top. So your eye is going to see 8 in the middle, but each of these breaks up into 16, giving it a lot more activity. Remember this slide later on. I can make those kaleidoscopes that look very kaleidoscopic at the back, but I typically now take that idea, I don't want the quilt to look as kaleidoscopic, and yet I will always use these same techniques. This is my very newest quilt that using quite a lot of the fabrics that are over at the over there for sale. And what I'm playing with now is the idea that I don't have to take 360 divided by the same 8 or the same 10 or the same 16. I now realize it just has to add up to 360. So what I have done now, and I'll continue to do, is for a while, this is actually a 60 degree, and that's a 30 degree. So it's 60, 30, 60, 30, 60, 30, and I'm getting all sorts of interesting effects. I'm having a lot of fun doing it, but to me these are quite a bit different. So I believe, and I just want to give you one little takeaway, a little lesson. I did have an exhibit at the American Folk Art Museum, and the day of the opening, someone said to me, "Don't worry, we'll fix the typo." And they meant they'll fix the typo in the banner, because they actually spelled the D and the I, they had switched around. They're spelled kaleidoscopes. This is what you should remember. In a situation like that, always say, what are you going to do with it? Can I have it? Because the emails went back and forth for a little bit, and the word came back that, yeah, Paula can have it. It won't be that dirty, because she'll get it next week, and it won't have that much poop on it. Because it turns out all the pigeons sit right up here. For like 3 months, they just do their thing. But my point is that anytime, in those moments, don't be shy. Just say, "Can I have it?" I've done that a lot. I even have a piece of that carpet now. And now passing this over to Catherine now. You can hear me, right? Okay, I'm going to talk mostly about technique. The first quilt that I made, where I printed most of the fabrics that I used, was this one in 1984. I had purchased a small, flat, articulated plastic mannequin at Pearl Paint. I stuck it down to fabric with some tape loops. And then I cut some zigzag shapes out of manila file folders and stuck them on the fabric, also with little tape loops. I used textile paint and a spray gun. And this is what the result looks like. You can see it's very imperfect. The spray paint came through the holes in the plastic template and left little dots on the fabric. And it also, the paint blew under the edges of the mannequin, so I compensated for that by doing some outline quilting. That image is actually from my second quilt using the same technique and the same mannequin. This is called Border Wars. In this one, I started to add other images, such as the weapons here, and I traced them from reference books, and I cut them out of Mylar and stuck them down with the double stick. Or I didn't use double stick tape, I used little masking tape loops. After that, I began to make quilts using images that I drew myself, and I printed the foreground images first. Then I masked them out and spray painted the background a gradual color change. I like to try a lot of different techniques. So in conventional forces, I designed all the fabrics as repeat textile patterns, and I printed only just as much fabric as I was going to use in this quilt. To make two triangle sections, I printed a 14-inch square and then cut it in half diagonally. Each color of each print is a separate stencil that had to be designed, drawn, traced, cut, and printed. When I make a stencil, I sometimes use contact paper and sometimes use Mylar. I draw a design on paper, trace that onto the contact paper, cut it out, and stick it to the fabric. Then I put a little textile paint on a dinner plate, and the stencil brush, if you've never seen one, is very, very flat. It's large and flat. And you pounce it up and down on the textile paint and then on the fabric, on the stencil. It's a good technique to use excuse me, for small detail color areas. You can overprint on commercially printed fabric, such as in the lower right side, and you get a nice crisp edge. One advantage of using a Mylar stencil is that you can wash it off and flip it over and print the image in reverse. In this quilt, I added a different technique, hand painting. The moon is hand painted. The other images are the techniques I was just talking about with airbrush and hand stencil. I also love hand embroidery and traditional quilt patterns. I make quilts by formula. The formula that I use is this. I take one current event, I add one traditional quilt pattern, I select a color palette, which in this case is everything but blue. And I pick a technique that I'd like to explore in depth, and that's either a sewing or a printing technique. The themes that I choose for each quilt that I make are something that I want to research and think about for several months. Usually something from the news, such as war, or more recently, environmental issues. This particular quilt covers both topics. It's about the environmental terrorism committed by Saddam Hussein during the First Gulf War. But I also have a sense of humor, and this was a fun quilt to make. We invented, my sons were in junior high school at the time. We made up some headlines. As walking through the grocery store line, they would see the Weekly World News, and they would actually believe the headlines that they saw. So we found out how easy it was to make up headlines. This is the quilt that when we started getting together as a Semper Tedium group, this is the one that I was working on, and I had been working on it for quite a while. This quilt was an unfinished object for 10 full years while I was concentrating on my day job. And we usually think of peer pressure as a negative term, but here I'm using it as in a good way. I'm giving credit to peer pressure, coming from the other artists in the Semper Tedium group, Paula, Robin, and Amy, with getting me back to being a quilter. The dominant fabric in this quilt is actually a commercial print. Those hot pink smiling condoms for sale at the fabric store. But I printed the lavender and white condom fabric in the upper right of the screen with a print Goco, which is a small screen printing device that's more like a toy than a serious art supply. That spurred my interest in screen printing, and I went to a one-day workshop in Philadelphia with 10 members of the Textile Study Group of New York, and we collaboratively designed and printed 25 yards of fabric. I thought it was quite an accomplishment that any group effort involving that many people actually had a good result. The print reminded me of things floating in the water, so I used my 2.5-yard section to make a quilt about New Orleans during Hurricane Katrina. The bottom section of this quilt is a traditional pattern known as ocean waves, to which I added hand-printed jellyfish, which I appliqued on. In 2009, I taught myself Photoshop specifically so that I could design fabric on the computer and have spoonflower printed. Second Wind was my first all-digital quilt, contains dozens of individually designed prints illustrating wind and electricity. It's obviously inspired by a log cabin or barn raising. It's identical in format to Conventional Forces, which was made 23 years earlier. I recreated the quilt with a different theme, a different color palette, and a completely different printing technique. This is a more recent quilt, Solar City. It combines a variety of techniques and fabrics. It's a utopian vision of a city powered by solar energy. And it reuses some of the electricity-themed fabrics that I had designed for Second Wind. This quilt is currently traveling with Quilt National 2013. Thank you.
I can't say enough of what a gift it's been, of friendship and just of space and time to be able to work uninterruptedly. I can be in my own studio, not having to go to my day job, and I will never get as much work done as I do on the cell phone. Even if I'm just puttering around in my pajamas, somehow the plants need watering, the email needs answering, and you know, it can be noon or 1 o'clock before I finally settle down to my studio. But when I'm out with the girls, get up at 7 o'clock sometimes and just get to that sewing machine. So it is such a gift. So what I'm doing here, I'm sitting on the screened-in porch in South Hold, and there's probably deer frolicking on the lawn behind me. But I'm taking out the basting of a quilt called Central Booking that I made for a Manhattan Quilters Guild traveling exhibition. Sure I can put it down, but now I can't see my scripts. Let's see. And this is, again, this is another shot of our workstations set up in the great room in South Hold. Let's see. Right. I'm set actually on two tables. This is my stenciling station. You can see that there's some stenciled letters in this quilt, so that's what I was working towards. So I'm actually showing them chronologically out of order. So on the right, you can see all of my different fonts. I pick fonts depending on what the theme of the quilt is, and if there's a reference to a specific historical period or to the text I might be quoting. I try to pick out different fonts, and that's part of my pleasure with it. And I have all my little squares of fabric cut out and ready to go. And I have to say that I threw myself on Catherine's mercy many, many years ago and begged her to give me a stenciling lesson. And you know, in 5 or 10 minutes you can learn the rudiments of it. It's not that difficult of a technique, but the skill is in the practice and the details, and practice, practice, practice. So this is Central Booking completed. There's a quote, the first line from Franz Kafka's The Trial, and it goes clockwise, starting from the upper left-hand corner. The QR code, the quick response code in the center of the quilt, if you have a smart device that has a reader on it, you will not get a link to a website. What you will get is the central part of the sentence. So it's both the letters that you see and the letters that you don't see in this particular quilt. And I haven't quite exhausted that theme, and this is Your Name Here in progress with the patchwork QR code at the top. That's finished. And then at the bottom, I've stenciled a bunch of what look like Chinese name seals, but they say things like Elvis and Steve Jobs, and John Paul, George and Ringo, and things like that. Oops. I guess I thought that the full quilt was here, but it's hanging in the back so you can go see it. I started this after the red and white show being on here. I found that so insanely inspirational and beautiful. Yeah. I should say for a moment that my day job is in audiovisual. I work for the Metropolitan Museum. I've been there almost 32 years. I'm so happy that I didn't have to set up a projector today. Thank you very much for taking care of that. So I have kind of a love-hate relationship with technology, and this is kind of one of my snarky outbursts on the subject. But one of the issues that's been brought up throughout the afternoon is how long did it take you to make any wooden quilt? And I can tell you in the case of Bella Figura, which is hanging back there, that it took 3 years and 3 months. Much of that time, I wasn't actually actively working on it. It was wadded up in the corner, or I was wadded up in the corner. Well, I'll just go through the slides. Was it December of 2005? Paula and Catherine and I were in Florence, Italy, and visiting a mutual friend. And from many, many streets in the historic district, the historic center of Florence, you can see that magnificent cathedral at the end of a little winding street. And so that was the impulse. I wanted to take that amazing cathedral, and this is not my snapshot. I have no decent snapshots. This is something I poached off the internet, and I wanted to combine it with her, who was a mannequin that I saw in a street market, in front of another cathedral close by. And because of her snarky expression and the fact that I saw the same model of mannequin a year later in Rome with a very kind of negroid coloring, I thought of her as Grace Jones. But she's actually probably more based on Bjork from her big-time sensuality period. But nevertheless, I still think of her as Grace. So, this is my first attempt. Why did it take 3 years and 3 months? This is my first attempt at the mannequin face. Too pasty, too small. Although I kind of like this one. There's someplace in the heat. So then those two were done with Wonder Under machine applique. This one was hand applique. It was much bigger. And I was very proud of it at the time, but now I'm thinking the same thing. But anyway, so I made a mannequin, and then the next step, the next part of the process was I was going to do the cathedral. That's at the far end of the street. And this is my first attempt. Now, I don't really get perspective that well. So I had set myself up for failure in a certain sense, because this is a very, very complicated building. It's complicated spatially, it's complicated because these mosaic designs on top of it are kind of disguising what the spatial relationships are. So it's like, what is that triangle? Oh, it's a buttress, or maybe it's a mosaic. So it was difficult for me with these low-resolution pictures I was getting off the internet to figure out what it was I was looking at. So months of research would go on. And the other thing that I kind of set myself up for delaying the process was that I realized that since I wanted her to be right up the picture plane, she was going to be gigantic in proportion to the cathedral. I had to move her to the side, so I had to figure out how I was going to extend this architecture that I didn't know what it looked like. There were just so many dilemmas. The other thing I discovered after I had already done that first version of the cathedral was the cutout filter in Photoshop. My Photoshop skills were so primitive, were so poor when I first started this process. I didn't, if anyone knows, besides Catherine, about tiling, about how to tile an image, I didn't even know how to do that. So it was just a torment from beginning to end. But I discovered this artistic filter called Cutout. And I loved it. I said, that's what I want the quilt to look like. So I went back to the beginning. Also discovered yet another photograph online that was further back on the same street. So now I had a wider vista to work with where I could place the mannequin over here. And I later found another one, this run through the cutout filter. So I had my work cut out for me, but at least now I had the roadmap. I also wanted to be able to see the top of the dome of the cathedral, which you can't in real life on that street. You can never get far enough back or far enough to the left to see it. But this is my quilt. I wanted a cupola, and I also wanted to be able to see that oculus, the window that's in the drum just below the dome. So a lot of research was necessary to find decent photographs, right perspective, right angle. Here's a cupola, it's cut out right. So this is my first attempt at getting that mannequin onto my new background. And I love cutout, but it does all kinds of weird things, and it really was not helping the architecture. And my biggest fear with this quilt was that people would look at it and they'd say, oh, the drawing isn't very good because I didn't understand the buildings. I didn't understand the perspective, and I didn't want it to fail for that reason. I wanted it, no matter how much I subtly distorted it, I wanted it to be plausible. So after completing this, I went back to the drawing board. The other issue with this, so many problems, I could go on for hours. I had finished her 2 years before, and once I finished the background and put her onto it, it's like, she's really not working. She's much too dark. She was just disappearing against the background. So I went back to that original snapshot. This is just the Photoshop digital image. And did her again, so what is this, the third or fourth time? So here she is pinned in place on what was the final background. And you've noticed that I have put in language. There were not those signs on the original photograph, but they were in different streets around the historic center of Florence, so they're legitimate, fair game. This is the back of the quilt top. Thank you, Catherine. And you can see I have stitched around every single raw edge. So I don't stitch around every shape, but just all the raw edges I zigzag on the machine. And this is the finished piece, which you can see over there. And I think people were surprised when I showed up with it with this stenciled border around it, but that was always my intention. It's just I had to get to that point. I really do love traditional quilts, even though this is so not traditional, but I love many things about them, including the fact that you have a center body and then you have a border around it. I like the framing of it. I think it's very elegant. It finishes a piece very nicely. So and in this one I've hidden a text from Henry James that is relevant to Florence. I've hidden it in the border. Let's see. The one that I did, this is not the next one I did. The next one I did were the two that I showed you at the very beginning of my section with the QR codes. I really needed to clear my mental palette. I just needed to work with big, simple shapes. But I love this technique. But what I did learn from the ordeal of working on Bethlehem, which by the way means good deportment, to cut a good figure, to be poised. What I did learn from it is that you better have good photographs to work from. If you want a lot of photographic detail and you don't want to have to make everything up and then worry, are people going to believe this? You have to start with good photographs. I also discovered that I really like working with kind of bilateral symmetry. I mean, I think that's Paula's gift to me, just working, in the same room as her for all these years. It's not true bilateral symmetry, but there really is a very, very strong central axis. And what else can I say about this? I like this pussycat very much. It was a statue on the street in Tokyo, and it's very, very literal treatment, and gave the opportunity to use a lot of different fabrics, which I really enjoyed. So this is in Quilt National 2013. And I think that's good for me. Yes.
Several times a year. I'm the only one who does not live in New York. I live in Philadelphia. And I live in a big house in Philadelphia, and I live near Drexel. My mother taught there. And yay, Drexel, not religious. Since I live in this big house in Philadelphia, when I get to New York, they squeeze me into the littlest space in the room, and I'm perfectly fine with that. I know that's my place. I make quilts, I make art from post-consumer materials, and I go through different periods. I started one place, and then different things move me. And in this piece, you see me working on recent work, but I'm immediately going to back up. And actually, I'm going to take you on a little trip. So you saw Paula's big house. I usually don't stay there unless I'm there alone, without people staying with me in the cottage. But I live very close by, a couple miles, in a tiny little cottage. So it's 500 square feet. And I try and lure people over. Here are just a few pictures of it, very cleaned up inside. I try to lure this group over because I live right on the beach. But they're really very hard to get out of Paula's house for any reason except food. We do have lobster dinners over at my house, once a summer. And here we are just kind of enjoying the end of the day. And we do eat very well, and we all cook, but most of our time is really spent stitching. This is the piece I was working on in 2002, or 1 or 2, when we first started meeting together. And I'm going to be talking about this during the Go Tell It section, so I will continue then there. It's a $100 quilt, but this is where I started, and I'm going to talk about it later. Let's not even get into it. The alphabet quilt, which I did in 1996, was a quilt I made for my son, like a baby quilt, as people do. And I think it was really the first piece I did specifically as a quilt. I work in a number of different forms. Over the years, I always return to the quilt form. So whenever I am working with any material, I experiment with that material in the quilt form, because it already gives me a language. It gives people a way to understand what I'm talking about. And I'm very much a traditional, very old-fashioned quilter, more so than all of these ladies, because I work with scraps, I collect things as women did hundreds of years ago, the pieces of our lives, and I put them together into something beautiful. I do want my work to be beautiful. This piece, the alphabet quilt, is made of crack vials, piece shards of glass from the street, little pieces of plastic from bottle caps, Publishers Clearinghouse stamps. We were getting those in the mail every week, those beautiful stamps. Yeah, so every time I work on a piece, I have to learn all over again how to handle the materials. I like process. I don't ever start thinking of where I'm going to finish. I start with an idea in mind, but I don't really know exactly where it's going to go or how elaborate it's going to get. I like beading a lot, and this piece, I took these materials and to highlight them, to elevate them, to make them important, these little pieces of scrap, I embellish things with time and beads. It's part of an influence of looking at like voodoo quilts that are heavily embellished. They're kind of spiritual in a way. That spirit of making and thinking is what drives me. These are not sharp, but I can't even talk about it. I don't know what to do. You can see most of them on my website also. Kiss Nature Goodbye was made with air fresheners. Car air fresheners and little girls' barrettes, those kinds of things I would see all over the playgrounds that would fall out of their hair constantly. So, and also the air fresheners I was finding in playgrounds. This is where when I had a young child. And to get the air fresheners were heavily embedded with perfume, and I had to figure out how to get this perfume out. I wanted the smell in the work. Didn't mind that, but they were very oily. So I don't know who gave me this idea, but I put them in cat litter. And I was able to suck all the oil out of them. So it's just a funny story that I remember while I'm looking at it. Everything I use and I work with, I've got to make holes in. I do a lot of drilling. I use tools that aren't necessarily quilting tools, but in the end, it comes together into that quilt format. This is the first log cabin quilt I made. The idea for making them was really a jar of twist ties in my mother's kitchen. And my mother often provided me with supplies. She probably didn't expect that her twist ties would do that. It would inspire me as much as some of the fabric she brought me. But these are leftovers. You know, they're things that they're made and they immediately have no purpose. You know, we use a few of them, we throw them away, but more than that, we collect them. At that time we were. They aren't around so much anymore. But these materials that we collect, they kind of have no purpose. Also, things that come out of dollar stores that become favorite of mine, just stuff that's produced and becomes trash immediately. This I went on to make about 8 twist tie quilts. So I sometimes get really involved in something that takes me a few years, but usually it leads on to something else. I started working with as soon as I saw the twist tie quilts, the twist ties, you know, I saw this strip pattern. That's how I chose them. You know, how can I work with this as a quilter? I make them in squares. I often work in little squares so that I can move things around, so I can take them with me. And I work in layers. I embrace glue. I love glue. So I always sew, and I only use glue to tack things down to start, and then I go over them, and there's heavily stitched patterns. Also with the twist ties, I wanted a little more color to them. And they were looking flat to me, so in addition to working with these minute little elements, I would first color the edges of them. And if you get up close to the ones that are hanging over there, you can see that I got another level of color going through them by actually running an oil crayon over the edges of each twist tie. The first twist tie, this twist tie quilt, this is something that I've been thinking about for years. And this is made from an Amish quilt that I had seen in a really early book by Holstein on American quilts. And this one, there was black ribbons with these beautiful colored edges. And that's where I got the idea of going back in with the oil crayon, with the materials before I put them together. So that I have these black twist ties that have another pattern running through them from the way I've arranged the colored edges. And these twist tie quilts, I was doing them at an interesting time in my life. This one is called blind stitching. About 6 or 7 years ago, or 10 years ago by now, I got Graves' disease, which is an autoimmune disease related to hyperthyroid. And your eyes just pop out of your head. It causes something in the muscles in the back of your eyes. I did this quilt called Blind Stitching, really pretty blind. And I realized at this time, I felt so empowered at this time when, you know, I'm a visual artist and my vision was really failing. It has since improved considerably. And I didn't really need my vision to make art. My art is coming from my brain to my hands, and my vision was really very secondary to that. It was a real empowering time in my life to realize that this was going to propel me forward rather than hold me back. It was a very important a couple of years. This is double vision. I also call it eye chart, but it's this idea of, you know, things being clear, you know, that eye chart as it goes down, you've got the pattern, and there's the breakdown of the pattern as it becomes smaller towards the bottom. One more twist type quilt, and this one was a much freer one to make. It's completely made out of collected twist ties. I also buy things. I don't collect everything. But the collected part does give me the idea. And this one really spoke to me like music. I just enjoyed it. It's very different from other work that I've done because it doesn't have that traditional pattern in it. New Orleans. This one, this quilt is called Best Wishes, and it's a prayer quilt for New Orleans. My husband is from New Orleans, and we visit a lot, and we were there before and after Katrina many times. On one of my walks through a cemetery in New Orleans, Holt Cemetery, a lot of it's one of the only cemeteries in New Orleans. It's a pauper cemetery, and people are buried in the ground, coffins in the ground. The water table is very high, and the ground was full of water, and it just turned over. These coffins came out of the ground, and as I was walking down the street, down the path, I saw bones. There were bones lying around. So these are chicken bones, and this one is here also to see in detail, and the vertebrae is beaded. I use them as beads, and they're red beads holding them down. These wishbones, my family was real fed up with art making coming to the kitchen table. Everybody would clean their bones really well for a while so that I could use them and I wouldn't have to deal with that. I have some good methods for doing it now, so you don't have to chew them clean. And also, it is a crazy quilt of scraps of fabric, though it looks like a large black piece of fabric. I also do like to work on velvet because it pops colors. It's rich. A lot of my backgrounds are velvet. This is a crazy quilt in the background made of a lot of scraps. Credit cards. You know, they called me some years ago. This, again, had to do with my parents died, you know, one parent after another. And I had my mother, you know, I gave away everything, like much too quickly, houses, cards, you know, whatever, you know, just as you go through parents' things and you have to settle an estate. But, you know, of course, I kept the credit cards and all the personal little stack of IDs because I love color and I love, you know, this spoke to me in the same way that I, you know, collect these materials. The colors that, you know, the color really spoke to me. Material did not really speak to me. And I have continued to play around with these cards. They're scraps. I collect them like you collect scraps of fabrics. I mean, they're just little cards. I organize them by color. And then when I'm working on a piece, I mine my collections and organize them by color. This is a really big quilt I made called Magic Carpet. I didn't bring it with me today because a lot of my work does not fold or roll like quilts do, and this is a problem of mine that I have to overcome. And this one, I just can hardly move it unless someone comes with a truck It only goes to music. It only goes places where somebody's picking up. There's no sewing in this one. This one is all glued together. And again, this is a piece, Modern Remnants, that the idea came to me through the floors of cathedrals in Italy, this tumbling block pattern, and the idea of the tumbling blocks, and this idea of the credit card and the tumbling. So certainly the materials that I'm using, I do mine the ideas behind them. I do mine the content when I'm developing the form and deciding what I'm going to do with them. And certainly the credit cards and other plastic health insurance cards, gift cards, they're so rich in material and history that even though the actual physical material of the credit card is so hard to work with, I'm still pursuing it longer than I have pursued other materials. This one is very fabric-like, and I am trying to get more into making these softer, making the shapes rounder. Again, it's called post-consumer tartan. It's made to look like fabric yardage. My work actually always has 3 layers because I just work so much in layers, so that it's usually a credible quilt technique, regardless of whether that's really important to me. So, I really often come back to that. But anyway, this one you can see my the little medallions that I've been making and trying to figure out how to make these quilts and how to use this material. And certainly I too will give Paula credit for this circular pattern and how things can work and the motion and the activity in that form. I don't only make quilts, but I do always make quilts. But this is a house of cards I made to kind of go through, to take that credit card idea and the patterning idea and experiment with it in as many different ways as I can. And so I use the different sides of the house and my huge collection of credit cards to play with the idea of the card, goes to the content, what is the idea behind it, and also the patterning and the forms that I can make with it. This is the living room, tumbling. It's got some big dice in it. It was just so much fun to play with. And there's one missing, but that's okay. And I'm still making cards. I'm trying to work with them. I'm going to make another big quilt, and I hope you see it in a year or two in a picture somewhere. And it's going to be 3-dimensional, and it's going to be able to fold.
Start spread.